Hello and welcome to the Just Culture Spotlight webinar series. This is the fifth in the series that we do on a monthly basis. You can find previous episodes on our YouTube channel. My name is Tony Power. I'm the founder and principal consultant at Just Culture Consulting. We help high-risk industries with just culture implementation to transform safety reporting into competitive advantage. The purpose of these webinars is to provide information and value on some various aspects of just culture, safety management, human factors, and as an opportunity for people to ask any just culture related questions that you might have, from the very basic to the very advanced. First off, I should say apologies for the slightly late start. We had some last minute audio issues, which I think we have mostly resolved. So hopefully I'm coming through okay and you can all hear me. Yeah, saw a few tweaks. For this session, we are going to be looking at a case study on professional negligence in a hospital that here in Australia. So the format for today is I'm going to speak for about 20-25 minutes. I'll summarise what this event was all about, and then look at how different models of just culture might handle that event and some of the considerations behind that. I'll definitely look at 2 and 3 if we have enough time. And then we'll have time at the end, 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. Please do feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat as we go, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, and I'll either answer them then or at the end, just depending on how we're going. If you have any suggestions for things that you would like covered in future webinars, please do put those in the chat as well. That would be great. Or alternatively, after today's webinar, if you want to suggest something for future topics, you can go to www.justculture.com.au/askquestions, and you can put your question there, and we'll have a look and answer it. All right, so we'll get into the case study for today, and this revolved around a tragic incident that occurred at a Western Sydney hospital in Australia in July 2016. It unfortunately left one baby with a lifelong disability, and another baby tragically passed away. And what happened was that these 2 infants were mistakenly given nitrous oxide instead of oxygen in the operating theatre shortly after delivery. So how did this happen? How did this event come to pass? So a year before, a man called Christopher Turner was subcontracted by BOC Limited. BOC Limited was a contractor of the hospital, and he was subcontracted to install and test some medical gas lines in several of the hospital's operating theatres. So this is July 2015, so a year before these 2 incidents occurred. And so he was required to cut into the existing gas pipes that were servicing 8 operating theatres in the hospital, and to connect extension gas pipes to some new wall outlets. Now, he was appropriately qualified to perform this work. He was a qualified gas fitter with experience in medical gas systems. He had completed BOC's training modules, but he didn't complete BOC's training on commissioning medical gas systems. Nevertheless, he did know that strict testing was required in order to prevent cross-contamination, or cross-connections, I should say, between gases such as oxygen and nitrous oxide, and that each separate gas line was to be tested. In terms of the work that he was doing, part of his contract was that he was required to perform his task in accordance with Australian standards, something that's a pretty standard contractual term, and I'll come back to specifically to that. Now, Mr. Turner, he worked with a BOC employee over 2 nights in July 2015 to complete the installation. Now, we don't know which of them specifically did the work on operating theatre number 8, which is the one that is relevant to this particular event. As I said, this work in Operating Theatre 8 involved extending existing gas pipes to a new neonatal wall outlet panel. Now, unbeknownst to Mr. Turner and the BOC employee, part of the original pipe work in the ceiling space had been incorrectly labelled during the hospital's original construction back in the mid-1990s. Now, this mislabelling had not previously affected gas delivery. It was only a section of pipe that was mislabelled, but it did create a latent risk. And what happened when they were doing this work on Operating Theatre 8 was that there was a cross connection made whereby nitrous oxide was delivered through the outlet that was intended to supply oxygen to neonates. Now, so this was an error that they made, which was undetected. Now, under the Australian standards, mandatory cross-connection testing and gas identity testing should have been performed. And this included isolating each gas line and testing each gas one at a time. Now, to conduct a compliant cross-connection test would have, under the Australian standards, would have taken no more than 10 minutes to perform, and the gas identity testing would have been about 30 seconds for each outlet. And had either of those tests been undertaken, it would have revealed the cross connection. Now, Mr. Turner had completed forms purporting to certify that he had conducted the appropriate tests as required by the Australian standards, and he then signed those forms. However, he hadn't actually conducted the required testing. And I can show you, and I'll bring up the, this is an example, this is one of the forms that Mr. Turner filled out, a medical gas outlet test form. And he recorded for Operating Theatre 8 that the oxygen concentration was 100% on both of the tests that he purported to have conducted, and so he ticked the passed column. And he obviously recorded a bunch of values here. Now, given the cross connection that was subsequently discovered after the incidents with these two babies, it came to light that these recorded values would not have been possible. The value at the standard flow rate would have been close to 0%, given that cross connection that had occurred in Operating Theatre 8. So Mr. Turner's conduct did not really involve signing the form saying that he'd undertaken those tests, but he would have had to have made multiple false entries for Operating Theatre 8 as to the details and the readings that he obtained. Now, if you notice, the readings for Operating Theatre 8 are identical to Theatre 7 and Theatre 6. So, it gives rise to a bit of a suspicion that, maybe all these tests were actually done at, the same time, and questions, well, were any of the tests actually conducted? But it was only Theatre 8 that had this underlying latent factor of the mislabeling of the pipes from the original installation back in the mid-90s. So as a result, the faulty outlet was approved for clinical use from July 2015. I should say that the form was also signed by the hospital engineer, Mr. Brightwell. He was an assistant engineer at the hospital. He signed as a witness to the testing, despite obviously not having observed any testing, and Mr. Turner knew that Mr. Brightwell did not witness any testing. Now, Mr. Brightwell had no formal qualifications when it came to medical gas systems, so we don't necessarily know, whether he would have been aware that what he was signing off on was not actually correct. Now, according to the Australian standards, an anaesthetist should have been present during cross-connection testing and gas identity testing to verify the results, but this didn't occur. So as I say, the faulty outlet was approved for clinical use, and between July 2015 and July 2016, 36 babies were born in operating theatre 8, but only 2 required oxygen from the newly installed outlet. And as I say, one of them unfortunately passed away, and the other had suffered a lifelong disability as a result. Now, after these 2 incidents, there was an investigation, and the cross connection was discovered. Mr. Turner was interviewed at that time by staff of BOC. He said he couldn't recall who had worked on which operating theatre, but he did say that he had knowledge of the cross connection tests. He was able to describe how that should be done, but he couldn't remember what happened on this particular occasion in terms of the conducting or not of these tests. There were various investigations. There was prosecution by Safe Work for work health and safety breaches against Mr. Turner, against Mr. Brightwell, against BOC, and Mr. Turner was also charged with manslaughter and causing grievous bodily harm by omission. And manslaughter is basically criminal negligence. So falling so far short of the standard of care that a reasonable person would expect and have exercised, and that falling short of that standard of care gave rise to a high risk of death as a result. Mr. Turner pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, 2 years and 10 months imprisonment with a non-parole period of 10 months. Now, apart from the actions of Mr. Turner, as is quite often the case with these kinds of events, there were organisational issues that sat behind it. Obviously, you have that latent risk from the mislabeling from the original works. The hospital hadn't followed its contractor management approvals procedures. There was no permit to work form. There were no risk assessments done. So there were deficiencies in the organisational processes. Also, the design of the work itself. There was no arrangements for an anaesthetist to be present as per the Australian standards. All the gases were isolated at the same time, which also went against Australian standards that only one system should be isolated at a time. There was also the issue that the installation and testing was going to be done by the same person, which, depending on the circumstances, might be okay, but obviously in this instance was not. So, as always, like I say, there are these underlying organisational issues that are present that contribute to an accident or incident sequence. So I'm going to run through now how might just culture address an event like this. And so I'll look first at the classic just culture model, which many of you may have seen before. It is James Reason's original model, and it's based around this idea of a culpability tree or culpability framework. So if we look through and run through this traditional model, it would be focused on Mr. Turner. That would be our, and this model, that would be our starting point, and we would look at, well, were the actions as intended? And I would, yes, you know, the actions in terms of doing the work was intended. Obviously, the cross connection was not intended, but his not doing the testing post installation were also intended. He was aware that should have been that should be done. But were the consequences intended, that there be this cross connection that babies would be harmed as a result? Clearly, no. Is there any suggestion of unauthorized substances? No, there's no evidence of that. Did he knowingly violate safe operating procedures? Yes. Clearly, Mr. Turner was aware of the requirements for post-installation testing, but he didn't do that. So then we go to, were the procedures available, workable, intelligible, and correct? And this is a bit of an interesting one, because looked at narrowly, you would say, well, these tests would not have taken much time 10 minutes and 30 seconds, respectively, for these two mandated tests. There's no evidence that we have, at least, as to anything that would have stopped him from conducting those tests. Sometimes with these kinds of events, perhaps people are working towards strict timelines and they're running behind and things like that. And I'm not saying that's not the case here, but there's no sort of evidence of that. And so on that level, you can say, well, yes, there was no sort of there's no reason why these procedures could not have been followed. And that leads you then to a possible reckless violation, and which, given the prosecutions that happened after this, is clearly obviously where this went down. You could also look at this and say, well, given an anaesthetist was not available, given that the two gas lines were going to be isolated at the same time, that actually it was not actually possible to do the work fully in accordance with the procedure, which then leads you to a system-induced violation. Now you might split those up and say, well, doing the work without an anaesthetist present is a system-induced violation. Not conducting the post-installation testing is still a possible reckless violation. So it's important to differentiate between these different levels. So on a James Reason model, you would have a reasonably high degree of individual culpability. Now, one area where sometimes then people fall over with this model is that they kind of then stop there, because of course we did identify those organisational issues. And even if under a James Reason model we get to a situation of high individual culpability, it shouldn't be that we just stop there and not consider those organisational factors and those system factors that have been identified. So that's broadly speaking how this might go down with a classic just culture model. There's more I could say, but I'm just conscious of time. So the next model I'll look at is a restorative just culture model. So this is a model that Sidney Dekker in particular has had a big role in developing. And this takes quite a different approach to handling these kinds of events. Where the classic model, it's very much a question of, given what happened, what is a fair and just way to respond, given human factors and organisational influences and so on. With the restorative model, it's more about repairing and restoring trust and relationships. It's very much a lot more forward-looking. And so its guiding questions are a lot more around who's hurt, what do they need, whose obligation is it to meet that need? And then it puts a strong emphasis on is there readiness to forgive, and to be able to try and facilitate that, which obviously may or may not be possible depending on the circumstances and the individuals involved, and really taking a restorative justice kind of approach. So now this table that I've just created is an incomplete list, but it gives you a sense of how this kind of process might work. So in terms of who is hurt, well, we clearly have the babies themselves and their families. What do they need? Among other things, information. They want to know what happened and why, to be able to express their grief and pain and to be heard. They obviously will need emotional and physical support, reassurance that this is not going to happen, that this is not going to happen again. They might need expressions of responsibility and remorse. So then we look at, well, whose the obligation is it to meet these needs? And some of it is for Mr. Turner. We're on those questions about how did this happen? Why did it happen? Mr. Turner, under a restorative just culture model, has an obligation to give his account of what happened. Similarly, the hospital. When it comes to things like reassurance prevention, the hospital has an obligation there. Regulators have an obligation there. So, but then we turn to, who else is hurt? Well, Mr. Turner, BOC staff, Mr. Brightwell have also been hurt by this. Mr. Turner went to, whatever we might think of how he went about his work, he didn't go to work intending for harm to be caused and people to be hurt. And he did express remorse in the course of the proceedings after this, as you would hope that he would. It's had a major effect on his livelihood. Now, all of those consequences may well be understandable, justified, and so on, but it is something that we need to recognise. So there are needs there, outlets to express responsibility and remorse, emotional support. There'd be a huge amount of guilt that that might well be appropriate, but still needs to be processed and supported. Whose obligation is it to meet these needs? Again, depending on his employer, for outlets to express responsibility and remorse. I mean, regulators in the community might have a role in that, to provide those kinds of outlets to do that. Who else is hurt? Well, clearly the hospital was hurt. They have needs for information, for reputational repair, for organisational learning. And again, various people have obligations there. So the Mr. Turner and the contractors have that obligation to provide information to support organisational learning. The community has been hurt by this, and they need information, they need reassurance, prevention, and so on. So you can see that a restorative model embraces a much wider range of stakeholders, just naturally. Now, where perhaps the restorative model can be challenged a little bit here is that where you have an individual who has acted in a way that perhaps we might call grossly reckless, perhaps, there can be restoration of in terms of relationships to some extent, but reassurance or prevention is something that maybe requires disciplinary procedures, in this case also maybe a prosecution. And so it's where a restorative lens on its own might be regarded as being incomplete, given the nature of the conduct. Whereas in a situation where there has been a bad outcome, when people have tried their best and there hasn't been that level of recklessness, it's just been the sort of like those honest mistakes and errors that we all bring to work. That is where a restorative model really is at its most helpful. So it's something to bear in mind with the restorative. There are these sort of edge cases where it can struggle a little bit. Doesn't mean that we should therefore abandon a restorative approach, but it may need to be supplemented with traditional backwards accountability in situations like this. I'm conscious of time, but I'll just very quickly bring up the revised model, which is sort of an attempt to bring, among other things, the classic and the restorative together, but it's very much focused on organisational learning. So with this one, it starts off, it's similar to the classic model. It's more individually focused. So in order to capture all the stakeholders, you have to run this sort of model multiple times. But did the person know what they knew to be right? Well, in this case, no. He knew he should have done that testing. Why did it make sense at the time? Unfortunately, and this is what happens when you get to when things get into a court process in an adversarial way, is that the information flow tends to shut down. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes we have to go through that process, but one of the unfortunate byproducts of that is that it limits our ability to answer this question about why it makes sense at the time. So we don't necessarily know exactly as to why, but given given the minimal time and that it would require to do that testing, how easy it would be, it is difficult to see whether that it's understandable why that made sense at the time not to do that testing. You potentially see that if 99.9% of the time you do the testing and it's fine, you could see a build up of complacency, perhaps, of expectation bias, and just, well, yeah, the test never shows anything, never shows an issue. So maybe you can sort of get some direction, get somewhere in that direction. But if we say no, did the person seek help and support? Seemingly no. So it lends to personal factors. Are there protocols and practices in place considered reasonable both in the working environment? I think yes. Again, we're not really aware of anything that would make that testing difficult or impossible to do. Are there any indications of ill health or other mitigating factors? Not really, and so it leads to a question of personal liability. So a similar sort of position that you would get in a classic model. But one thing I do like about the restorative, the revised model, is it does provide options for learning from excellence and identifying where you're going to get the best potential for systemic learning, to around are you seeing consistent themes and things like that. So there's a lot more to be said about the revised model, but again, just conscious of time. So I've got a couple of questions that I can see in the chat. So I'll go to those. Firstly, one from Marlon: how would Just Culture address the role of Brightwell signing off testing he didn't witness, especially given his lack of qualifications? Yeah, so depending on which model you were running, obviously if you're running the restorative model, then he would be one of those stakeholders that I mentioned that you would bring into that process, and so he would have an obligation to give his account of what happened. If you're running a classic model, for example, it shows that you would have to run that classic model multiple times to capture the different stakeholders, including Mr. Brightwell. And so there, you would be looking at what procedures were, was he given? Was he aware of those Australian standards? It might well be that he wasn't, because he didn't have those qualifications. And so there it might be an identification of a systemic risk and where the process has fallen down. But you have to run through that through that model and examine his own particular circumstances. Faru: can Just Culture still apply when someone being convicted of manslaughter, or does the legal process override it completely? So that will depend a little bit on the jurisdiction that you're operating in, but certainly as an organisation, if something has become a criminal a criminal matter, obviously that has to run its course. But as an organisation, you've still got to deal with the employment aspects of it. So you may be able to run the Just Culture process immediately. It may be in some situations you have to sort of put that in abeyance. And then whether you need to then suspend the person or not is obviously going to depend on the circumstances. But the short answer is, I would say, is yes. You still have to deal with that situation at an organisational level, and so that what's going through your Just Culture process. All right. So it looks like that's all of the questions for. Oh, there's another question. What can organisations do to prevent people signing forms for work that hasn't actually been done? Yeah. I mean, so I think on one level, obviously, it's a disciplinary issue if people are doing that. But at a wider level, it's looking at the system and looking at, okay, what is the purpose of that form, and what is it trying to achieve? And it's very much going to that kind of workers have designed work as imagined versus work as done kind of scenario, where if people are signing off for work that isn't being done, being curious and going, well, why is that? What's going behind that? And it may well be that there are systemic issues going on, that maybe it's not possible to do the work as the form envisages, but the work requires the form to be signed regardless. So what needs to be done is to either re-engineer the form or change the work environment, the work system, such that it can be done in a compliant way. Sometimes there may be issues of personal conduct there, and then that goes more to a coaching space. But again, it's really about being curious and trying to understand, well, why is that happening? Because you need to understand the why before you can diagnose a potential response. All right, so I think that's all the questions that I can see. So thank you for joining me today and those great questions. I hope you found this webinar useful. If you have any more questions that you think of that come to you after this webinar, like I say, please do feel free to ask them. The next webinar, we haven't decided on a topic yet. But be on the lookout for that. It'll be on LinkedIn and YouTube. The next webinar will be the 22nd of April at 12:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. So daylight savings will be finished by then. Yeah, so if you have any questions about today's webinar, if you have any questions or suggestions for a future webinar, then you can go to the website www.justculture.com.au/askquestions. And you can also use it just to send any Just Culture related question, and we'll have a look at that and answer that for you. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you again next time. Thanks very much.